Now we've got a really exciting session from Development Engagement Lab. Big warm welcome to Jennifer and Molly, who are joining us. So if you don't know who Development Engagement Lab are, they are a think tank. They research public engagement with global poverty and international development in Great Britain, France, Germany and the United States. They are based at the University College London and the University of Birmingham, and they're a grantee of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And today we're joined by Jennifer Hudson and Molly Anders. Jennifer is the co-director of Development Engagement Lab and a professor of political behaviour at the University College London. Thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer. We're really honoured that you've given up your time and are able to come and run a session for us today. And Jennifer's joined by Molly Anders. Molly is the Research, Impact, Communications and Engagement Lead at DEL, Development Engagement Lab. And in this session, Jennifer and Molly will present the latest data on attitudes and engagement with aid and poverty and Great Britain, as well as public attitudes towards small development organisations and those working in partnership with local communities. They will also share a recent experiment examining public attitudes towards aid that tackles gender inequality. It sounds really, really interesting, really useful insights. So thank you, Molly. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us. You should now have access to control the slides. Is that correct, Amber?
Jennifer has. I'm sorry, but I can't find Molly. Apologies.
I don't see Molly either, but I do have control. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully Molly will be able to join in a bit, but thank you, Jennifer, for joining us. We really appreciate you being able to present a session for us, and it sounds really interesting, and I know this will be valuable to so many of our members. If you're tweeting along, Development Engagement Labs are on Twitter at Deb Engage Lab if you want to tweet them, and also do go and have a look at their website, which I'm sure they will, Jennifer will share a link to later on as well. Great, over to you, Jennifer. Oh, Molly has just joined us now. Great. So yes, over to you, Jennifer, whenever you're ready to start. Thank you.
Molly was going to do the first bit, but while she's getting herself sorted, I'll just do a very brief intro and then maybe hand back. So thank you.
I'm actually here. I can jump
in.
Here.
Go for it.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm a little late. I was having some connectivity issues there. Yes, but really lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having us. I'm sure Jennifer has said a little bit already about the Development Engagement Lab, but yeah, just to say we had a relationship with SIDCN for quite some time now, and we're just really happy to be here and happy to be a resource for all of the organizations here. So what are we? DEL is a research organization looking at public attitudes and engagement with aid, as you're already familiar. We conduct quantitative research in 4 countries, that's France, Germany, Great Britain and the US. We're a grantee of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we're currently based at University College London and the University of Birmingham. You might remember us as the Aid Attitudes Tracker. So we've been asking some of these questions of the public for quite some time now. And the earliest iteration, yeah, we were AAT. So you might be familiar with some of our research from there. So we have 3 sort of main survey instruments. It's the tracker, the sandbox, and the panel, and I'll say a bit more about those. Excuse me. So in terms of our resources, and I want to stress here that our resources are open to everyone. It's part of our grant that we're a public good. So all of our data is available to you to use internally, externally. We just ask that you cite us, and we include some citation information on this deck. So we have a website, Development Compass. So this is our blog, and this is also where we list all of our publications. The dashboard is our tracker instrument. So we produce this 3 times a year for all of the countries where we track, and it's all of our engagement and attitudinal data of the public. So that comes out every couple of months, and we actually just have a fresh one for you today. The In Brief series is a series of short reports. So then we have the longer reports and bigger studies that you can find also on the website. So we wanted to talk through like the state of public engagement with global poverty in Great Britain. So this is our tracker, as I mentioned. That's our citation site, as I mentioned. Again, this is included, excuse me, in all of the decks that we produce, so you can always find that information there. So what are the big changes that we've noticed since we last tracked in January? The biggest change we've probably seen in Great Britain, there's been a 7% decrease in those that say they care about global diseases and pandemics. That's that square to the far right. That's a significant jump, and obviously still sort of the hangover from COVID, we think. There's also been a 5% increase in those that say they care about education, healthcare, clean water, and hunger in developing countries. But those are our core sort of development interests, and we lump those together. So you'll see in a second the full list of issues that people care about, and you'll see that, yeah, that one saw quite a big increase. There was also a 5% decrease in those that say they care about economic crises, job security, and wages, which has been really interesting. Maybe coming, off of obviously still in a cost of living crisis, but people are experiencing sort of lower energy bills possibly, and so they're maybe less concerned about that. So this is our engagement battery. And this serves as kind of the foundation of our segmentation. So we use these behaviors basically to categorize the public into segments in terms of how they engage. And those are marginally engaged, fully engaged, and you'll see a full sort of list of those in a second. But these are the behaviors basically that we track in order to create those segments. And there hasn't really been a statistically significant, or as I accidentally typed yesterday, statificant. So that was interesting. Feel free to use that in your own work. We observed no statistically significant changes in our behavioral engagement indicators. The only small change that we noted was a 2% fall in the percentage of those who donated to global poverty charities and NGOs. Again, not statistically significant. We tend to see a spike, an increase in donations over the holiday period. So it could be sort of a hangover from that. But for all other indicators, the changes are sort of 1% or less, showing virtually unchanged profile. And then, as I mentioned, yeah, these are the segments. So again, hopefully this can be of use to you in thinking about your engagement with the public. Many of our partners adapt this and sort of create their own segmentation, or just take it, off the shelf as is. And use it to track. So you see not much movement between the segments, just that 1% drop in the fully engaged. But yeah, so normally if there's been quite a lot of movement, you can kind of see how that works. But there, the marginally engaged, you can see that is the sort of yellowy color. That tends to be the segment that organizations are mostly interested in because they're sort of the fence sitters, right? So they're the ones that are waiting to be moved, you might say. And then in terms of donations, as I said, yeah, we saw that increase, 5% up donated to a global poverty charity in the past 12 months in GB, and that's from January. And you see these downturns in donor numbers for Germany, Great Britain, and the US. France sees a small, albeit not statistically significant, increase of 1% in the percentage of respondents who say they've donated in the past 12 months. So yeah, with the exception of Germany, percentages of donors remain above historical averages. And then efficacy, my favorite topic. So we define efficacy as the feeling that you have that you can make a difference. So you can have personal efficacy. You can feel like you can make a difference in the world. And then you obviously have efficacy for the government, for development NGOs and charities, for businesses and corporations, and then for the UN and other international organizations. Not huge changes in efficacy for this one. We saw some big changes in France, actually, but you see that 1% increase and people feeling like they could make a difference personally, and then a small increase for the UK government, and then a slight decrease for businesses and corporations. And then the most important issues, I hinted at this a little bit earlier, but this is the full list of issues that we test. So as I mentioned before, we saw that decrease in economic crises, job security, and wages in terms of concern. And then we saw a decrease in concern for the inequality between the rich and the poor, 4% increase in concern for that development panel, the education, healthcare, clean water, and hunger. And then a really interesting 6% increase in those concerned about technology, automation, artificial intelligence. And I wonder if that is largely because it's been in the news quite a bit more. 7% increase or decrease there in global diseases and pandemics. So in terms of attitudes and public opinions, these are kind of the highlights of what we've seen comparing with data from January. There's been a 2% decrease in those who think the world is getting worse, all things considered, a 2% increase in those who think what happens in developing countries affects them too, a 3% increase in those who are concerned or very concerned about levels of poverty in poor countries, 1% increase in those that think we should give some aid or give it generously, and then 1% increases across the board for those who think development aid is effective or very effective, and those who say they have some or a great deal of trust in development NGOs and charities. And I see some questions in the chat there. I'm just going to get to the end of this section and then I'll have a look at those. In terms of aid support, this has been in the news lately and a hot topic for us. So you may have heard the Minister for National Development, Andrew Mitchell, pledge to increase aid support by 20% over the next 10 years. He was using our tracker here, our tracker data to think about that. So he was very excited at the prospect that there might be segments of the UK public that are movable. So we're looking at kind of that 20% that might be able to be moved over the next 10 years. And the good news is that since we started talking to him about that, it's increased 3%. So that's 3% done and dusted. We only have 17% to go. So we're at currently the majority, 51%, think that we should keep or increase our current aid budget in the UK. So that's, again, we're seeing the majority of support in most countries. We have seen a little dip in Germany. Aid support is stable, right? So it's aid support's increased by 3% both in France and in the UK compared to June 2023. And again, none of these changes are statistically significant, but we're watching them very closely. And then we break it down into who, asking who supports development aid. Who are these people? What are the sort of socio-demographics of them? So these are our sort of standard splits for that. So you have age, you have gender, you have education, socioeconomic class, and you have your voting history. And there you can see sort of a map of the UK that shows where support stands. Just to say again, we're going to make this presentation available to you afterwards. So yeah, this is yours to use. Okay, so there I'll just pause and check the chat for questions. Let's see, so we have, are you asking the same sample or different each time? And what is the sample size? So this is our tracker. This is not the same sample each time, but it's around 3,000 individuals, adults in Great Britain for each tracker. So we do have the panel, which goes back to the same sample. So you do get some continuity there. And so those are typically different topics, but we do have an instrument that does do that. Oh, and Jennifer asked that. Great, excellent. So only the panel, same individuals. And then, so though of course a large proportion of the UK budget stays within the UK. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, definitely a problem there. And then we've got, yep, and then Jennifer has listed the samples there, so that's brilliant. Excellent. Okay, so I can move right along if there are no other questions. So a couple of years ago, we were working with SIDCN, and we just started, and their big question, obviously was, what are public attitudes towards smaller NGOs? What does the UK public think about these? Not the big names necessarily, these smaller organizations, which do make up sort of the majority of the NGO community, as you all know, in the UK and abroad. So we wanted to understand what their attitude is if things change when they think about the way that these organizations function versus those larger ones with the huge budgets and bigger fundraising budgets and campaigns. So we wanted to see what that looked like. And so we also wanted to look at local partnerships, what people think about organizations that are working in partnership, both, mostly in the countries where they work, so in the global south. So we were very keen to see that, and that's been of a lot of interest, and we hope to redo this experiment, as this data is from 2021, so it's probably about time we get an update. So on average, the British public see only small differences between large and small NGOs in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, in terms of reducing poverty in poor countries. A significant proportion of the public don't have views on the effectiveness, efficiency of large versus small. But there's a large percentage of don't knows in that. So it suggests that this is a topic that respondents aren't thinking a lot about. And it's an opportunity for improving communications. As you'll see in a second, there are certain associations that the public have with smaller NGOs that are advantageous for you. So if you sort of use these in your communication. So the large percentage of, so as I said, more effective and efficient organizations are better, obviously, but size is not a determining factor of that in the public's mind. So in terms of trustworthiness and honesty, and this is what I was getting at. So the data show here a clear and significant, statistically significant relationship between size and trustworthiness and honesty. So large organizations are seen as less trustworthy and honest than small organizations. So similar to effectiveness and efficiency, there's roughly 4 in 10 British respondents say they don't know on trustworthy and honesty. But again, that's an opportunity. We always see the don't knows as people sort of that are waiting to be convinced. So for all NGOs, but particularly large organizations who need to improve the perceptions of trustworthiness and honesty. But I would say also for small organizations that haven't necessarily made the most of this and use this to sort of integrate into your brand, into your communication strategy, this aspect of trustworthiness and honesty. So in terms of differences between large and small orgs and how those are driven by those judgment, it's just reiterating basically that in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, it's small, but the public definitely see these large and small organizations differently when they evaluate NGOs, thinking about trust and honesty. So you can see there, the orange, where the small sort of sits in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, not huge, and then honesty and trustworthiness are quite a big gap there. So something to keep. And then what about developing partnerships with the local community? So 44% of the public, this is a pretty big chunk, think that it's important for large NGOs to partner with local organizations to deliver programs. So that's across the board, right? Where there is opinion on partnerships, it leans more favorably than not. That very small percentage, 11%, don't think it's important to develop partnerships. But however, more than 2 in 10 say neither important or unimportant, and a further 2 in 10 say they don't know. So once again, yeah, this opportunity here to emphasize those partners and put those partners on a platform. So yeah, this one maybe seems a bit intuitive, but we asked whether funding NGOs who work in poor countries can help build capacity and self-sufficiency in local communities. We wanted to know if the public sort of see that local work as having a purpose and improving self-sufficiency, which we know the public are keen on in conversations of aid. So 44% think funding NGOs that work in poor countries helps build capacity and self-sufficiency. It was only 9% of the British public that disagree with that statement. So that's a really big sweep. Nearly a quarter of the public say they don't know. Again, opportunity for communicating community-based capacity building work with the public. And then 24% don't have a strong view, so that those people are very much open to influence. So UK public are much more likely to pick smaller NGOs and charities when it comes to donations or petitions. This is really interesting for us, as you would think the name recognition would play a bigger role there. But we saw when we asked respondents to choose between 2 random appeals for donations, they're 5% more likely to pick a small NGO or charity compared to a large NGO or charity. Respondents also prefer organizations headquartered in the UK. So this is interesting because I know, small charities can't necessarily compete on the campaign front, on the fundraising front. So they're not going to be sort of side by side with these bigger charities. But there's something to be said for investing that small amount that you do have in getting that presence on social media, on email, banner ads. There's something there, because when the public are faced with that choice, they do choose small. So we also saw 5%, increased likelihood of choosing smaller organizations when we asked them to sign a petition. So you have that in a sort of non-financial engagement aspect as well. So, just to sum up, the British public think that small NGOs are more efficient slightly, more effective slightly, less less dramatic there, but definitely more honest and trustworthy. Yeah, we saw the largest difference in assessments when it comes to trust and honesty. And so it's really an opportunity to emphasize those characteristics when you're talking to the public. And developing partnerships with the local community is important, as is the capacity building and self-sufficiency that is generated by those partnerships. And that's strongly driven by engagement levels. But even among that marginally engaged group, which you remember I mentioned are kind of the key interest group in terms of swinging towards support, even among those, more than 4 in 10 support local partnerships. Definitely something to emphasize. And then small NGOs and charities enjoy a boost for donations and petitions, but respondents prefer UK-based organizations that work in WASH, and this is the predominant issue to elicit support we found. Great. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jennifer, but I'm going to check first if we have any questions. Oh, hi, Paul. Paul's in the chat. Hello, Paul. Lovely to see you there. So Paul says size and trustworthiness and honesty, the considerations of local engagement, i.e. knowing an organization beyond the marketing to personalization of engagement, the real meaning of localization. That's absolutely profound, Paul. I think that's definitely true. An excellent thought. And then Jamie says, really interesting range of statistics here. Thanks so much for the presentation. Lots of great takeaways. I'm always very aware of the language we use in talking about poverty and global challenges. I note that you're using this from poor countries. Yeah, in your presentation, to use this term throughout your engagement with the public. So we don't actually do much engagement with the public directly. We mostly just engage with folks like you and organizations. And so we have used poor countries as a question in the past in the survey. So we're basically just mimicking that language. So that's the kind of language that the public recognize. Definitely, we recognize that is retrogressive now and shouldn't really be used in public engagement. It's something that we're thinking quite a lot about, and really switching mostly to global north, global south, and thinking about it that way. The problem is the public don't necessarily recognize that as fully. And in the survey design, we want to make sure there's sort of the least friction as possible, in getting them to understand the question. So that's kind of a catch-22 that we're in at the moment. It's a really, really good question and something we are thinking about. So unless there are any other questions there, I'm going to hand over to Jennifer, who's going to talk to you about our recent work on gender.
Great, thank you, Molly. So we, in the last couple of months, we worked with all of our partners in the 4 countries that we work in to come together to design one of our sandbox studies to look at public attitudes towards gender equality, and in particular understandings of feminist foreign policy or feminist diplomacy, as we might talk about it in France, and to see how well the public can track that conversation that NGOs are having, and how those specific policies either land or don't land with members of these donor publics. So the first thing I want to share is just a little bit of baseline data in terms of how the public think about and understand gender equality. And the data here is comparative across all 4 countries. So the first thing is just kind of understanding where the publics are at in each of these 4 countries. So the first bit there on the left is the percentage of people who think, kind of as a matter of principle, that men and women can be equal. And you can see that this is above 70% in each of the 4 countries, with France and Germany there at nearly 80%. We then asked the question, tell us do you agree with the statement that, men and women have become more equal in the past 10 years? So this is really about a progress question. Here we see a lot more variation amongst the 4 countries. So at the top, 70% of Germans say that they think men and women have become more equal in the past 10 years. GB and US at 58 and 57%, but France, just over 4 in 10 of the French public think that there has been progress in terms of gender equality. We then gave the respondents in each of the 4 countries a very long list of reasons about why women and men might be treated differently from each other. And the top reasons in all of the countries are culture, so kind of embedded cultural practice, and men's resistance to change. And you can see that that was relatively consistent in all of the 4 countries that we operate in. So we then asked respondents to think about some statements, excuse me, about generally speaking, do you agree or disagree that, for example, the very top line, tackling gender equality is morally the right thing to do? The second one, that ending discrimination against women and girls is necessary to ending global poverty. And then kind of going all the way down to the bottom, the country. So here it would be the UK shouldn't impose its values about gender equality on developing countries. And so what you can see there is, if we go back to that top one, these are showing the percent who agree or strongly agree with the statement. And so, 54% of the US respondents said that tackling gender equality is the right thing to do. So clear majority support in the US. But that goes up to 3/4 in France. And you can see GB is there just about 2/3 along with Germany. So I think one kind of takeaway here is that talking about the kind of moral imperative and that, equality between men and women is generally the right thing to do lands well with the British public. This is kind of a space where they kind of agree, and there's openness to this argument. You can also see that across the 4 countries, ending discrimination against women and girls is thought to be necessary to ending global poverty. So people do explicitly recognize the barrier that discrimination against women and girls is having against kind of achieving overall poverty alleviation targets. If you go down, and I'll just go to the second to the bottom of those, we asked the question, or we gave them the statement, having specific targets for tackling poverty amongst women and girls won't do much to help reduce poverty overall. So it's a slightly different take on the second phrase there. And what we really wanted to try and get at was, to the extent to which the public had an appetite for gender-specific policy program where we are setting in targets to achieve particular outcomes for women and girls, and whether the public thought that that was, necessary or unnecessary. And so what you can see here is about 4 in 10 in France and Germany, but 3 in 10 in GB said that having these targets won't do much to help. So if we take the kind of inverse to that, we think that generally people would think that having specific targets is a worthwhile prospect to kind of drive forward poverty alleviation amongst women and girls. So this notion that we can set targets, specific targets in our policies, does tend to work well with the British public. Okay, I mentioned in one of the earlier slides about perceptions of gender equality. And here we asked the respondents in each of our 4 countries to compare gender equality gaps in their home country and in developing countries. So the column on the left-hand side looks at where respondents think whether men and women have become more equal, and that's the bit in gold, whether equality is kind of more or less the same, or there are less equal in the last 10 years. So Germany, 70% of respondents say that they think men and women have become more equal in Germany over the last 10 years. But you can see that number is halved when they think about gender equality in developing countries. And that pattern of halving is reasonably consistent across countries. So the takeaway here is that whilst donor publics see significant increases in gender equality in their own countries, they see less progress in developing countries. And if we look down at GB, again, 58% in GB think that there is more gender equality happening between men and women in the last 10 years. But that's 27% in poor countries. You can also see in GB in particular, there's a significant proportion of people who say they don't know. So there's just not a lot of kind of knowledge or sight around that for the British public. We then asked respondents, and here we asked women only. So the responses you see here are women-only responses. And what we see here was we were trying to understand whether there was a gender dimension to support for gender equality, and whether there was a kind of sense of allyship, particularly amongst women and girls in donor countries, and whether that kind of extended to whether they think that this was an important set of policies, either globally or in developing countries in particular. So the first question we asked here was about relatability. So the question is, I can relate to the experience of women and girls in developing countries. And perhaps not surprisingly, this one doesn't get a lot of agreement. So just 26% of British women said that they agree or strongly agree that they can relate. And so this is really something interesting to reflect on, the common experiences that women might have in terms of whether that's childbearing or rearing, whether that is, opportunities or lack of opportunities in the workplace, whether that's kind of discrimination and other practices. Even in those kind of general terms, women aren't thinking in the UK of women in developing countries as kind of having a similar set of experiences. 30% say they don't know, they neither agree or disagree. But a third are saying that they disagree in terms of that relatability question. Again, if we look down to the second, we see this kind of strong semi-moral imperative of helping to improve the lives of women and girls in developing countries as being the right thing to do. And every time we tend to ask questions around support for poverty alleviation or around aid, and in this particular case around helping women and girls, the language of this being the right thing to do is something that really lands well with the British public as well as in other countries. And so if you're looking for language that is helpful, that meets the public where they are, this activity being the right thing to do is something that does garner quite a lot of support. We then asked questions around, do you personally feel a responsibility to take action to improve the lives of women and girls in developing countries? And you can see here that this looks less supportive than the previous question. So 32% say, I personally feel a responsibility to take action. There's a huge chunk there in the middle, that 39%, who say I neither agree or disagree. So kind of looking for opportunities to move and shift. It's thinking about that 39% and how we can, in speaking to women in GB, how do we get them to think about the actions that they can take at an individual scale and a small scale to help women and girls in developing countries. We asked a similar set of questions to men, and I'll just kind of deal with the top line one here because I think it's a really good and important one. 66% of men think that without men's participation, we will never achieve full gender equality. So I think there's a really nice story to hear that we do have a high degree of allyship with men, that they are part of the kind of path to gender equality, and it's necessary for them to be taking action as well. Okay, this just gives you, and I highlighted this in the very first slide, this just gives you the top 3 reasons in each of the countries that we survey, the reasons that women are not treated the same way as men in developing countries. So this is explicitly for developing countries. And as I said, it was religion and that role of culture and history that kind of were the top 2 for each of our 4 countries. For Germany, Great Britain, and the United States, the third reason is men's resistance to change. But in France, there was more kind of a legal dimension saw by the public, that there was a lack of laws that explicitly provided guarantees for gender equality. Okay, so those are just some of the kind of top line findings that we've seen around general attitudes towards gender equality, both in terms of the home country, but also perceptions in developing countries. And moving to that second part of the research where we were trying to really understand so that we could work and kind of think alongside our NGO partners, how talking about feminist development policy or feminist diplomacy lands to a public that we're trying to have a conversation with. And so the first thing that we wanted to do was think about how do the words feminism and feminists affect the conversation that we're having with the public. So we asked a question here, which was thinking about the idea of feminism. So it was phrased exactly like that, thinking about just the idea of feminism, thinking about the people who call themselves feminists, and thinking about the actions taken by feminists. So 3 different kind of dimensions. Please indicate whether you personally think of them as positive, negative, or a mix of the two. So 48% of respondents think feminism is a positive or a very positive thing. And you can see that support for it being positive for feminists and actions taken by feminists falls deep, it falls a little bit as you kind of move more specifically to a feminist as an individual and the actions taken by feminists. But what's interesting here, I think, are those chunks of kind of blue there in the middle that don't have either positive or negative kind of connotation for our respondents. So we didn't see, in my mind, kind of overtly negative judgments about feminism, feminists, or even the actions taken by feminists, which I think was a really important starting point for thinking about feminist development policy. Or feminist diplomacy. We asked respondents and we gave them a wide range of words, kind of both positive and negative in valence, about the words that they would associate with feminism. And again, we see quite a lot of consistency in the 4 countries. So just focusing in on GB here, feminism was most strongly associated with fairness, with inclusivity, and with justice. It's probably worth pointing out in the United States, it was fairness, justice, and sexist. And that was the only place that we saw one of the more negative connotations. But we've seen, I think, quite a lot of significant gender backlash conversations in the US in recent years. So perhaps not surprising. Okay, let me move to the next slide. All right, this one is, sorry, I probably could have done a better job of taking the numbers out and just framing it for you. But what we wanted to understand from our respondents was whether certain policy areas were gendered in their mind. So did they think of things like education, health and family planning, welfare, economic growth? Did they think of those explicitly being gendered, i.e. women's issues? And did how we talk about those issues then affect support for them? So how did we set this up? Here's a little bit of a tiny experiment where we said, okay, thinking about education in general, in general and government spending on education. Tell us what you think is kind of first, second, and third most important. And so the general question, thinking about education in general, thinking about health and family planning, that's our baseline. That's the starting point without any reference to women and girls or gender equality. The blue line represents a reference, in general, to thinking about women and girls. So here respondents were prompted to think about women and girls and how government spending on overseas aid to improve the life of women and girls was given to them. So they were explicitly prompted to think about women and girls. The gold bar, respondents were explicitly prompted to think about improving gender equality. So what we were trying to do here, in addition to seeing whether some issues were gendered, was to try and figure out the impact of the language of talking about improving the life of women and girls versus improving gender equality. So is gender equality a little bit of a laden term for some in the public? And what you can see is there's not really a penalty to talking about gender equality, but it doesn't lift support as much as talking about women and girls when we look at education and health and family planning. So when you say, thinking about government spending on overseas aid and effort to improve the lives of women and girls in particular, you get 10% more people saying they want to prioritize education than if you just say, thinking about government spending on overseas aid, and you don't make any reference. So talking about women and girls is particularly effective language if you're trying to prompt or move things around education and health and family planning. Now, when we gave the frame gender equality, that still lifted folks 5% on education and 3% on health and family planning, but not as much if you just talked about improving the lives of women and girls. And you can see there on that bottom half of the graph, the impact was consistent whether we talked about women and girls or gender equality. Those policies just weren't selected as frequently as education, health, family planning, and welfare. So the takeaway here is there are some gendered policy areas that people think that are just more in the remit of helping women and girls, and that's education, health and family planning, and welfare. But talking about women and girls and improving their lives in particular boosts the support for those particular policy domains more than just talking about it in general, or if we talk about gender equality. Okay, so just to summarize some key insights. Donor publics in the 4 countries clearly think we've made progress toward gender equality, and they believe it's possible for men and women to be equal as a matter of principle. Majority of men, nearly 2/3 of men, also believe that their participation is necessary to achieve gender equality. In terms of making successful cases for gender equality, majorities believe that tackling gender equality is morally the right thing to do. They believe that ending discrimination in women and girls is necessary to ending poverty, or sorry, inequality, but they disagree around the targets. So GB public were relatively supportive of the targets, other countries less so. The public are also a little bit skeptical about seeing their values imposed on other countries. That did vary across our 4 countries, but we need to be kind of careful about the exporting of British values, keeping the language talking about kind of basic fairness and it being the right thing to do in principle as a kind of basic moral value, I think is an okay thing. But once we kind of move that into GB values or US values, it gets a little bit trickier. While the public believe that gender gaps have closed, particularly in donor countries, we see less closing of gender gaps in poor or in developing countries. We've seen in other analysis that we didn't show today that the optimism for closing these gender gaps is a bit low. And so what we've seen in some work is that talking about progress, reinforcing the notion of progress is really important to boosting that optimism with the public. Feminist and feminist actions do have some negative connotations for the public, but not overwhelmingly so. Less so for feminism as a general kind of principle or idea. When we talk about particular policy areas, it's education, family planning, water, WASH that are the clear winners in terms of public priorities for addressing gender equality. I think, Olivia, you can stop sharing there. And that's a lot of data for you. So really happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you, Molly, as well for joining us. It's just been such a fascinating session. I know there's been a lot of information, but I hope everyone's found that really, really useful. We will be sharing the slides and sharing the recordings with everybody after this. Also, just to say as well, I'm just putting a link in the chat here. Do have a look at Development Engagement Lab's website, sign up to their newsletter if you're interested in getting kind of regular updates about this kind of information. It's just so interesting and so valuable. So yes, thank you so much, Jennifer and Molly. We have got a bit of time for questions. I know some questions have already been kind of discussed and answered in the chat, but if you do have any more questions, please do pop them in the chat. I'm not sure if this has been answered already, but Julian had a question. When asking about gender equality, what's the ratio of men and women asked, and can the answers be aggregated? I'm not sure if that was already been sort of covered slightly.
Yeah, Julian, so we can pull out the tables. So we just have some straightforward crosstabs on all of these questions, and that's something that Molly can share with Olivia. So you can break this down by both men and women, and the total would be available in those tabs. In terms of the ratio, so all of our data are weighted to be nationally representative. So if in our survey there were 55% women, that would have been weighted to reduce women to the national percentage, which is, you know, roughly 51 point something, I think these days. I won't confess to be on top of exactly what the number is. But if women were oversampled in our survey, they'd be weighted down and men weighted up to kind of make sure that it is nationally representative gender break. That's true for education, voting intention, age. So we weight across a range of the socio-demographics to make sure that what we're showing you is a nationally representative sample.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions? I know there's some questions earlier, but I think Molly's addressed those already. If anyone's got any other questions, do drop them in the chat.
Sorry, I could ask one more question. Do you think that the phrase feminism is too closely associated with kind of socialism, and therefore people are nervous about it?
Oh, that's a good question.
It is a good question. I mean, I think any isms have their challenges. I would expect that there's probably some of that contamination, as if you would say communism, or, you know, any of the other kinds of things which reflected a particular movement and a particular moment in time. My instinct is, though, that it's probably less of that, and just the kind of historical context with which feminism has been viewed and understood. And if we take the kind of the kind of more critical caricature of feminists, you know, it was kind of angry women, right? And it wasn't necessarily about just, actually, we just want equality between women and men. So I think my guess is it's probably just more of the historical legacy of the different waves of feminism and how they've been understood. I also think that this is really conditional on where you sit in the socio-demographic profile. So I suspect for younger respondents in our audience that they have very little understanding of kind of historical feminism or the first wave of feminism, and they come at it with a very kind of different view, which is feminism is about equality between men, and it doesn't have kind of any of that cultural or historical legacy. I suspect if you're slightly older and you were alive through the first wave of feminism, that you may have different kind of connotations. And I think that's certainly driven by age, education, and gender as well too. So, you know, if you were to pull out where the more negative understandings of feminism come, I suspect they're probably more driven by some of those socio-demographic characteristics than necessarily association or correlation with other types of isms. But it's a really good empirical question.
Great, thank you. There's just another question just come in. How far is this tracked back?
Claire, is that the gender stuff, or is that just the tracking bits from the beginning that Molly did?
That was, I guess, all of it really. It was just it's I think it's amazing. You've literally blown my mind. And to be fair, Olivia has been saying this, has said this to me, I think after the last time she'd heard information from you guys. But yeah, just wonder like how far back, because this is invaluable, and you know, understanding things like social media and how the world is changing and how people absorb information, and that changes their perception. And it'd be so interesting to see how that's changing over a period of time as media and how we absorb information changes.
Yeah. So it's hard to give you a really straightforward answer, Claire. The gender stuff that I've just presented was from February. It's a one-off. It's a deep dive into gender. There are a few questions in there that we've tracked over time, but that is all new stuff, and so it's hot off the press. The material that Molly presented in the beginning, which is part of the dashboard that she talked about, that we have tracking data from the beginning of 2018, which was the start of this Dell project. We have relatively some consistency going back to 2013 on some of those measures, because that was the start of AAT. It's a little bit tricky because we broke panel, and we, over time there's a little bit of issue with survey, but different questions have different time dimensions to them. I think it was Julian maybe that asked this question about, did we track what newspapers folks were reading? And I said that we did a really big media wave, 2 years ago, could be 3 years ago now, where we asked lots of questions around media. It was a huge piece of work. And so Molly will share that with Olivia and your group, because it does answer some of the questions around where are the public, what are their touch points with global poverty and international aid? Is it true that everybody's on social media? No, it's not. So there was a nice bit of myth busting in there in terms of where the public are at. And again, then the breakdowns by age groups was really important, because young people are kind of different in the way that we expect them. So yeah, that would be a piece we'd be happy to share.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer and Molly, for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. Just one thing to say to everybody as well is we will be sending a short feedback form at the end of the event today, and we would love to get your feedback. And if well, to be honest, I feel like all our sessions are so valuable, but if this session in particular is something that you think, do you know what, this is so valuable, we'd love to hear more, then we can look at organizing another session with Jennifer and Molly in the future. So we'd love to get your feedback on the different sessions. And I know there was similar comments from the sessions earlier today about risk. Yes, Adrian's got his hand up. Is that a question there, Adrian?
It's just a comment, actually, a positive comment. Sorry, my name is Adrian Jones. I'm trustee for a small charity that's been working for 20 years, supporting operating theatre staff in Africa, Friends of African Nursing. And we had a webinar less than a month ago, and talking to Posholi from Lesotho, who was tucked up in a woolen jumper, saying, well, it's winter here and there's snow on the ground. But actually, she turned out to be a nurse anaesthetist. So she was the only nurse anaesthetist or the anaesthetic person in the hospital. There were no other doctors there. I said, well, how do you get some support? Well, I know where to get a proper anaesthetist, but I am the person that's on call today, and I will deal with somebody that needs a general anaesthetic, or I can give a spinal or an epidural for a pregnant mum. So, some of the stuff that goes out there on there is just, we were just bouncing around saying, that's amazing. Thank you. Well done.
Oh, thanks, Adrian. Thank you. Great. So I don't think we have any more questions. So I think we're going to wrap up this session now. Again, just a huge thank you to Jennifer and to Molly for joining us. As I said, all our speakers throughout the whole day are giving up their time for free to join us, and so we really do appreciate that. And as I've said, we're going to be sharing the slide deck and the recordings with everybody. So yes, thank you. Really do appreciate that, and there's a lot of love for you guys in the chat as well.